Elena lifted her burgundy wine glass and held it up to the light. Through the deep crimson liquid, the crystal chandelier hanging above the living room fractured into hundreds of tiny sparks. She tilted the glass slowly, watching the wine slide down the curved sides. It was the kind of thing people did when they were pretending to think, or delaying a conversation whose ending they already knew. Across the dining table, Anders was talking. He had been talking for several minutes. About quarterly budgets. About the balance in their joint account. About the raise he'd received after his recent promotion. About how much financial pressure he had carried over the past 2 years while she pursued writing full-time. His words were precise, structured, impeccably logical, like a lawyer delivering a closing argument, which, conveniently, was exactly what he was. "I'm not saying you haven't contributed, Elena," Anders said, dabbing the corner of his mouth with a linen napkin. The napkin caught her attention. Oatmeal-colored linen. She had bought it the week before from a small handmade textile shop in Brooklyn because she loved its understated elegance. Even the way he folded it afterward was symmetrical, perfect, controlled. "I'm simply saying that every relationship requires both people to provide value," he continued. "Do you understand what I mean?" Elena finally set down her glass. The base touched the marble tabletop with a soft click. A tiny sound, yet somehow it felt like a signal. "Value," she repeated quietly. The calmness in her own voice surprised her. "You call what exists between us value. What else would you call it?" Anders leaned forward slightly. His gray-blue eyes held genuine confusion. "Every relationship is a form of value exchange. That's basic sociology. People stay together because of economic value, emotional value, or..." "Stop," she interrupted him, not because she was angry, because she was suddenly tired. Not ordinary tiredness. The kind that rises from somewhere deep inside your bones. Like swimming through freezing water for hours, finally reaching shore, only to realize it's not the place you were trying to reach. She stood and slipped the wool cardigan draped over her chair onto her shoulders. New York evenings in May still carried a chill, especially when something inside you was rapidly cooling. "I need some air," she said. Anders didn't stop her. He never stopped her. He believed adults should be capable of regulating their own emotions. To him, that was another form of value. Not burdening your partner. Not creating unnecessary inconvenience. Respect, as he defined it. When Elena pushed open the heavy iron door of their apartment building, the night wind rushed toward her carrying the damp scent of the East River. She inhaled deeply, for the first time all evening. It felt as though her lungs had filled with something real. Not air. Something else. Something she could never quite find inside. Anders's perfectly maintained apartment, where every room felt permanently set to the ideal temperature and humidity. She wandered south along 2nd Avenue without any particular destination. In her coat pocket, her fingers brushed against a few coins and a crumpled receipt. The East Village was still alive at this hour. Groups of young people clustered outside bars, smoking cigarettes and laughing loudly. A man sat beneath a street lamp strumming a guitar, singing a song she didn't recognize. Elena moved through the crowd like a ghost drifting through a celebration. Nobody noticed her. She barely noticed anyone. By the time she reached 4th Street, rain began to fall. Not a violent storm, just a soft, persistent drizzle. The kind of rain that felt like the city itself was sighing. People hurried toward awnings and storefronts. Some held backpacks over their heads. Others ducked into convenience stores. Elena didn't move. She stood in the middle of the sidewalk and tilted her face toward the sky. Raindrops landed on her forehead, her eyelids, her lips. She couldn't remember the last time she'd stood in the rain. Anders always carried an umbrella. Rain, he insisted, was evidence of poor planning. It led to colds, lost productivity, unnecessary complications. Everything he said was technically correct. Yet standing there now, feeling water trickle from her hair down the back of her neck, Elena experienced something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt awake. Just a little. "Do you need an umbrella?" The voice came from behind her, low, slightly rough, like sandpaper gliding across wood. Elena turned. A man stood a few feet away holding a large black umbrella. He wore a dark gray work jacket with the collar turned up and a faded black t-shirt underneath. Rain had flattened his hair against his forehead. He looked somewhere around 40. Fine lines gathered at the corners of his eyes. But those eyes, those deep brown eyes, were bright, like two small lanterns glowing in the middle of a rainy night. He stepped forward and extended the umbrella over her head. You don't have to. I know. His interruption was gentle. But you're soaked. He glanced up at the umbrella. And I happen to have one. Then he shrugged. It's not a transaction. It's just a fact. It's not a transaction. The words struck something inside her. A place she hadn't realized was still tender. Like a guitar string wound too tightly for too many years suddenly, touched by a careful hand. A quiet note echoed somewhere deep within her. Thank you, she said softly. You're welcome. He smiled. Not a big smile, just enough to deepen the lines around his eyes. My name's Ben, he said, and before you start wondering, no, I'm not some random creep. He pointed across the street. I work over there. Elena followed his gesture. Across the road stood an aging auto repair shop beneath a weathered sign that read, Thompson Auto Repair. Half the paint on the letter O had peeled away. The sign looked as though it had survived several decades and 1,000 rainstorms. I'm Elena, she replied. Then she laughed softly, a little embarrassed. Aren't you going to ask why I'm standing in the rain? Ben considered that for a moment. Then he smiled again. No, why not? Because sometimes people stand in the rain when they don't know where else to stand. Ben didn't ask any follow-up questions. He didn't do what Anders would have done immediately, begin analyzing the reasons behind it. Instead, he tilted the umbrella a little farther toward her. His own right shoulder slipped into the rain. The dark gray fabric of his work jacket was already turning darker, soaking through inch by inch. Sometimes, Ben said, watching the blurred glow of city lights at the far end of the street. Standing in the rain is the answer. He paused. You don't always have to put a Y in front of it. Elena turned and looked at him. Raindrops slid from the umbrella's ribs and splashed onto the pavement below. Streetlights filtered through the curtain of rain, scattering into warm halos that outlined his profile. He looked like a charcoal sketch someone had drawn in quick. Strokes rough around the edges, unfinished in places, yet strangely alive. They stood there without speaking. Time seemed to slow enough that Elena could hear the subtle differences in every raindrop, striking the umbrella above them. Some landed with dull thuds, others with sharp taps. Some were carried sideways by the wind and struck the metal frame with tiny metallic pings. For some reason, she thought about her first date with Anders. It had rained that day too. Of course, Anders had checked the forecast in advance. He had brought 2 umbrellas, one for each of them. When they arrived at the restaurant, he carefully folded his umbrella, shook off every drop of water, and stored it inside a waterproof carrying sleeve he had brought, specifically for that purpose. At the time, she found it attractive. A man who was organized, a man who seemed capable of arranging life into neat and predictable categories. It took her 3 years to understand what existed on the other side of organization, control, and what existed on the other side of predictability. A refusal to allow anything unexpected to happen. Yet sometimes, the unexpected was the only thing that reminded you that you were still alive. What do you do? Ben's voice pulled her from her thoughts. I write novels, Elena said. Then she corrected herself. At least I used to. She looked down at the wet pavement. I haven't written anything in almost 2 years. The confession surprised even her. She had never said it out loud before. Not to anyone. Not even to Anders. Whenever he asked how the writing was going, she always gave him one of the usual answers. It's coming along. I'm outlining. Almost there. The phrases had become a transparent wall between her real struggle and his expectations. Yet standing beside this stranger who smelled faintly of motor oil and rainwater, the truth slipped out effortlessly, as though she had casually set down a stone she had been carrying in her chest for 2 years. Ben nodded. Nothing more. He didn't tell her to stay positive. He didn't suggest a change of scenery. He didn't mention a friend who worked in publishing. He simply nodded, the same way someone might nod if she had told him it was raining. After a moment, he spoke. I had a friend once. His voice carried the distant tone people use when telling stories from another life. He was a chef, worked at a pretty good restaurant. Ben glanced down the street as they walked. For an entire year, he couldn't come up with a single new dish. Not one. Not one. Every day, he just repeated the same menu items. Could have cooked them blindfolded. What happened? He quit. Elena blinked. He quit? Ben nodded. Walked away. Started selling hot dogs on a street corner. She laughed softly. And then, he sold hot dogs for 2 years. Ben's mouth twitched into a faint smile. Then one day he went back into a kitchen and created a dish He still can't explain. A dish? Yeah. Ben shrugged. That dish ended up getting featured in the food section of the New York Times. Elena looked at him. What did he say happened? Ben stopped walking for a moment and looked up at the clouds. Then he smiled. He told me the fire on the stove never went out. He glanced at her. I was the one who closed my eyes. The rain had nearly stopped. The steady drizzle had faded into occasional mist. Tiny droplets clung to Elena's eyelashes, blurring her vision whenever she blinked. Is your repair shop still open? She asked. Ben shook his head. Closed hours ago. Then what are you doing here? Forgot my keys in the office. He pointed vaguely back toward the garage. Came to get them. Then he smiled and saw a woman standing in the middle of a rainstorm. You could have just kept walking. Absolutely. The answer came without hesitation. Then why didn't you? Ben considered the question. Finally he said, because you didn't look like someone who needed to be managed. He looked at the umbrella above them. You looked like someone who needed an umbrella. Elena laughed. A real laugh. The first one all evening. Maybe the first genuine one she'd had in a very long time. Not the upward movement of muscles. Not politeness. Not performance. Just laughter. How long have you been fixing cars? She asked. 15 years. That's a long time. Started when I was 25. And before that? Ben hesitated. I worked as a financial analyst. That caught her attention immediately. A financial analyst? She raised an eyebrow. And now you're a mechanic? Big leap. I know. His tone suggested he'd had this conversation many times. But it was the best decision I ever made. They crossed an intersection as he continued. Back then I wore suits every day. TIs, meetings, numbers. Sounds successful. I made good money. He smiled. I also barely slept. Elena glanced at him. So what changed? Ben shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. One day I realized I didn't actually care about numbers. What did you care about? He didn't answer right away. Instead he looked toward the repair shop across the street. A broken car? What about it? The sound it makes after you fixed it. His eyes brightened beneath the streetlight. You ever hear an engine come back to life? Elena shook her head. Ben smiled. You don't forget it. He spoke with surprising tenderness. It's never perfect. Sometimes there's a little extra noise. Sometimes the idle isn't completely smooth. But you know it's alive. He looked down at his hands. A few hundred pieces of metal working together. And somehow, after being broken, it starts moving again. Elena listened quietly. What struck her wasn't the story. It was the way he told it. Every word seemed to come from somewhere deep and unedited. Nothing polished. Nothing arranged for effect. Just truth. She had spent so long listening to Anders speak in perfectly constructed arguments, every sentence organized, every point supported, every conclusion purposeful, that she had almost forgotten people could talk like this. Like they were discovering their thoughts as they spoke them. Like they weren't trying to convince anyone of anything. They continued down 2nd Avenue. The rain had stopped completely. Ben folded the umbrella and shook the water from it in one casual motion. No ceremony. No precision. Just a practical gesture. A few drops landed on the back of Elena's hand. She left them there. Can I ask you something? Her voice was tentative. Ben nodded. Sure. She hesitated, then stopped walking. Do you think a relationship has to be? The sentence died halfway out of her mouth. Ben didn't rush her, didn't fill the silence, didn't help her finish. He simply stood beside her, matching her pace, giving her room. Finally she took a breath. My husband told me tonight that relationships are basically value exchanges. The words felt heavier now that she was saying them aloud. Economic value, emotional value, social capital. She stared at the wet pavement. All of it added together like some kind of balance sheet. When she said the words balance sheet, her voice trembled. Not from sadness. Something more complicated than that. Like suddenly realizing that the place you'd called home for 3 years was never really a home at all. Just an architectural blueprint. Every room labeled. Every corner measured. Every function carefully defined. Except nowhere on the page was there a space marked home. Ben was quiet for a moment. The puddles scattered across the street reflected the neon lights overhead. Red, blue, green shattered into fragments beneath passing footsteps. You know what causes the most mistakes in auto repair? He asked suddenly. Elena blinked. The question seemed to come out of nowhere. Still, she played along. What? Looking at the numbers. Ben shoved his hands into his jacket pockets as they walked. You hook a car up to a computer and it tells you everything. compression ratios, ignition timing, air-fuel mixture. Every measurement has a recommended range. He shrugged. If you fix a car using nothing but those numbers, you'll end up turning a perfectly good machine into something that meets every specification on paper and still drives like a piece of scrap metal. He pulled a wrinkled handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the rainwater from his hands. The really good mechanics don't rely on data in the end, he continued. They rely on feel. Feel? Ben nodded. You put your hand on the hood and listen with your palms. He held one hand out in front of him as though resting it on an invisible engine. Some vibrations never show up on a diagnostic report. His eyes lifted to meet hers. But your hands know. You know something's wrong not because you calculated it. He smiled. You know because you felt it. Elena stopped walking. They stood beneath an old street lamp. Its pale light stretched her shadow across the wet sidewalk, long and distorted. She stared down at it. For a moment, it felt as though a door inside her one that had been locked for years had cracked open. Feel? She repeated quietly. Yeah. Ben stopped too. Relationships are the same way. The city hummed softly around them. Intimacy isn't an exchange of value. His voice remained calm. It's a feeling. If you treat it like a transaction, you'll end up with a perfectly written contract. He glanced toward her. But you'll never end up with a car that actually runs. The words landed inside her like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread outward, touching things she had spent years carefully avoiding. She remembered a winter shortly after she and Anders got married. She had come down with a terrible fever. Anders bought medicine, made soup, took half a day off work to stay home with her. The next morning, he created a spreadsheet, a detailed one. Body temperature readings, medication schedules, symptom progression. He had proudly explained that it would help them quantitatively assess recovery trends. At the time, she had laughed. She had even posted a picture online with the caption, "Married an AI." But standing here now, years later, she suddenly saw that spreadsheet differently. Every number, every column, every carefully organized data point. They felt like deposits into an invisible account. An account labeled, "What I am owed in return." It wasn't that Anders had never loved her. He had, in his own way. What she had never felt from him was something else. Something unconditional. Something that existed without justification, without efficiency, without cost-benefit analysis. The same warmth she had felt earlier when Ben angled the umbrella toward her and quietly allowed his own shoulder to get soaked. "Why were you standing in the rain?" Ben asked. This time, Elena didn't hide behind "I don't know." She thought for a few seconds. Then she answered honestly, "Because I feel dried out." The words surprised her. "Like I've been dried out for a long time." The moment she said it, heat rose behind her eyes. Not tears. Something deeper. Something frozen finally beginning to thaw. For 2 years she hadn't written a single meaningful page. She had blamed herself. Maybe she'd lost her talent. Maybe she'd become lazy. Maybe there was some logical explanation. Anders could diagram on a whiteboard at 2 in the morning. But suddenly she understood. She hadn't stopped writing because she'd lost creativity. She'd stopped writing because she'd stopped feeling. Her life had become too carefully measured. Calories consumed. Weekly intimacy targets. Quarterly savings goals. Annual self-improvement benchmarks. Anders called it managing a marriage. But inside those numbers, Elena felt like a fish living in a perfectly regulated aquarium. The water temperature was always ideal. The oxygen levels always stable. Everything necessary for survival was provided. Yet she could no longer remember what the ocean tasted like. Have you ever really listened to an engine start? Ben's question interrupted her thoughts. She shook her head. I drive. A faint smile crossed her lips. But I've never actually listened. Come with me. He turned before she could respond. Walking back the way they had come, Elena hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she followed him. She didn't know why she was walking through the East Village after midnight beside a man who had been a stranger 90 minutes earlier. But her feet never slowed. Maybe because she hadn't done something without a reason in a very long time. And for once, it made her feel alive. By the time they reached Thompson Auto Repair, the corrugated steel garage door had already been pulled halfway down. Ben ducked underneath it, then lifted it higher for her. As she stepped inside, the scent hit her immediately. Motor oil, metal, old machinery. Not unpleasant, not harsh, something steadier than that. A smell that suggested every inch of air inside the building had been used, worn, and lived in. The garage wasn't large. 2 vehicles occupied most of the space. A silver Toyota Camry sat beneath bright work lights with its hood partially open. Routine maintenance, probably. Beside it rested an old red Ford Mustang, half covered by a canvas tarp. The exposed paint had faded with age. 68 Mustang. Ben walked over and gently patted the roof. The gesture felt strangely affectionate, like greeting an old friend. Been sitting here for 3 years. The owner can't afford the repairs. Won't sell it either. So once a month I start it up, just to keep the engine moving. He pulled away the tarp and slid into the driver's seat. Elena stood near the front of the car, watching his silhouette through the windshield. Ben inserted the key and turned it. The engine coughed. A low, rough sound, like someone waking after a very long sleep and clearing their throat. He tried again, a little louder this time. A third attempt, a fourth, a fifth, then on the 6th, the garage filled with a deep, thunderous roar. Elena froze. She had never heard anything like it. It wasn't music, yet somehow it carried more power than music. The sound was rough, uneven, alive, a giant mechanical heartbeat waking beneath the earth. It vibrated through the air, through the concrete floor, through the soles of her shoes, up through her bones, until it seemed to resonate directly with her own heartbeat. Ben leaned out of the driver's side window. A streak of black grease marked the base of his thumb. His eyes reflected the headlights, bright enough to rival them. You hear that? His voice was nearly swallowed by the engine. Still, every word reached her clearly. It's not perfect. The left cylinder leaks a little. The carburetor needs cleaning. He smiled. It doesn't meet a single ideal specification. For a moment he simply listened to the engine run. Then he looked at her. But it's alive. The smile softened. Can you feel it? Elena didn't answer. She stepped forward and placed her palm against the hood. Warm metal met her skin. Beneath it pulsed a subtle, uneven vibration. Not smooth, not perfect, but undeniably alive. The vibration felt like a language older than words. And somehow, she understood every syllable. She stood there, her palm pressed against the old engine, an engine that met no standards, broke every rule, and yet still roared defiantly to life. Without warning, tears spilled down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness, nor were they tears of joy. They were the kind of tears that come when, after surviving the deepest winter, you suddenly touch the warmth of spring soil for the first time. The body reacts before the mind can understand why. Ben climbed out of the car and walked over to her. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a tissue. He didn't ask, "What's wrong?" There was none of the carefully packaged concern that Anders would have considered appropriate. He simply stood beside her, quiet and steady, like a tree that had weathered countless storms without ever leaving its place. The engine continued running. Gradually, its growl settled into a low, rhythmic hum. The sound filled the entire garage, leaving no empty spaces and no need for explanations. Elena cried until there was nothing left to cry. Then she wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater, rougher than she normally would have been. She knew her mascara was probably smeared. Her nose was definitely red. She probably looked like a mess. For once, she didn't care. She had spent far too many years caring about everything. "Can it still drive?" she asked, pointing toward the Mustang. Her voice was hoarse from crying. Ben looked at her, as though he heard something in the question she hadn't actually said out loud. "Yeah," he replied, "but it needs work. The head gasket has to be replaced. Fuel lines need cleaning. The entire brake system needs to be rebuilt." He paused. "About a month." "A month," Elena repeated the words. Then she did something she couldn't explain even to herself. She smiled. It was a small smile, but it softened her entire face, as if the rain she had just cried had washed away years of accumulated dust. "When it's finished," she said, "will you take me for a ride?" Ben looked at her for a long moment. His gaze wasn't like Anders's, always evaluating, measuring, assessing. It was simply there, like the work light hanging in the corner of the garage. Never bright enough to blind you, just bright enough to help you see where you were going. "Sure," he said. Then, after a beat, "Whenever you feel like hearing the engine again, come by." By the time Elena left the garage, it was well past 1 in the morning. Ben had handed her a clean towel to dry her hair. It smelled faintly of laundry detergent, mixed with the lightest trace of motor oil. An odd combination, yet somehow comforting. At the doorway, she turned back. "Ben." "Yeah?" He was draping the canvas cover back over the Mustang without looking up. "Thank you for sharing your umbrella." Ben kept working. "Thank you for standing in the rain," he said. "Otherwise, my umbrella wouldn't have done much good." When Elena reached her apartment building, she looked up and saw the living room lights still on. Of course it was. Anders was probably waiting for her, phone in hand, a clock glowing on the screen, calculating exactly how long she had been gone and whether that amount of time fell within an acceptable range. She stood on the sidewalk and stared at the illuminated window. For the first time, she realized she wasn't looking up at a home. She was looking up at a machine she had once mistaken for one. The wind shifted. She caught the scent of rainwater, motor oil, and detergent clinging to her clothes. It wasn't a pleasant scent. Not elegant. Not the kind bottled and sold as perfume. But it was real. The kind of real that doesn't need to be analyzed or measured. The kind that lets you close your eyes, take a deep breath, and know without question that you are alive. She slipped a hand into her pocket. Her fingers found the crumpled receipt, a few coins, and a neatly folded piece of paper she didn't remember putting there. She unfolded it. A business card. Thompson Auto Repair. A phone number had been written on it by hand. On the back, penciled in rough but confident handwriting, was a single sentence. "Feelings don't need a reason. If they did, they wouldn't be feelings." Elena turned the card over several times. Then she pressed it against her chest. The paper was thin, yet she could feel its weight, like a small, warm anchor. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the front door. The living room light was still on. Anders sat on the couch. A cup of tea had gone cold on the coffee table beside him. An open copy of The Economist lay spread nearby. He looked up when she entered. Almost instinctively, his brow furrowed. His eyes swept over her soaked hair and ruined makeup with the efficiency of someone reviewing a report that required analysis. "You were out in the rain?" he asked. "You know rain exposure can lower your body temperature and weaken your immune system. And tomorrow you still have, Anders." Elena interrupted him. Her voice wasn't loud, yet there was a calm certainty in it that surprised even her. "I need to tell you something." Anders removed his blue light glasses and sat up straighter. He waited, the same way he might wait for the next item on a meeting agenda. Elena remained by the entrance. She hadn't even taken off her shoes. Rainwater seeped from the soles, leaving faint marks across the polished oak floor. Anders glanced at them. His lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. "You once said that intimacy is a form of value exchange," Elena began. "I've thought about that a lot. I thought about it in the rain. I thought about it in a repair shop." She took a step forward. Another wet footprint appeared. "You might be right. Most relationships probably are transactions. Work relationships are. Business relationships are. Even many friendships are." She took another step. "But that's not the kind of intimacy I want." Her voice remained steady. "I don't want to be calculated by you. And I don't want to calculate you. I don't want to give something and immediately wonder what I'll get back. I don't want to receive your love and feel indebted for it." She paused. Something caught in her throat. Then it passed. "I want," she said softly. "I want to be with someone who can feel me." Her eyes met his. "Not someone who can figure me out." Silence filled the room. For a long time, Anders said nothing. His expression barely changed, but Elena noticed the way his fingers tightened around his glasses. The knuckles had turned white. "When did you start thinking about all this?" he asked. For the first time, there was a crack in his voice. A small one, but enough to break the flawless, airtight shell of logic he always seemed to wear. Elena thought for a moment. "Probably," she said, "when I realized I hadn't truly cried in 2 years." Then she turned and walked toward the bedroom. Not to pack her bags. Not to continue the argument. She simply needed to change into dry clothes and find a safe place. For the business card in her pocket, a place where she wouldn't lose it. Outside, the rain had started again. Heavier this time. Drops hammered against the windows in a steady, relentless rhythm. Standing by the glass, Elena pressed her palm against the cold surface and felt the faint vibrations carried through it. The sensation reminded her of the Mustang, of the roar beneath the hood, of the way the vibration had traveled through the metal and straight into her body, and of what Ben had said. Feelings don't need a reason. If they did, they wouldn't be feelings. It had taken her 34 years to understand those words. But now she finally did. Outside, New York was being washed clean by another storm. Neon reflections shattered across wet pavement, then reassembled themselves, only to break apart again. The city had never lacked rain. and it had never lacked people willing to stand in it. But very few remembered, once the storm had passed, what it actually felt like when the rain touched their skin. Elena decided she wanted to be one of those few. She pulled her hand away from the window. A faint imprint remained on the glass, for a moment before, disappearing beneath a new layer of mist. But the warmth was still there. The vibration was still there, like a heart that had begun beating again. Deep inside her chest, it rumbled with a low, steady power. We live in an age obsessed with measurement. Productivity is tracked through metrics. Social influence is counted in likes and followers. Even love is increasingly reduced to categories such as economic value, emotional value, and social capital. Phrases that sound rational and sophisticated, yet often leave something essential behind. We approach intimacy the way accountants approach balance sheets. We calculate investments and returns. We keep silent ledgers in our minds, recording who gave more, who received more, who owes whom. And then we wonder why we feel exhausted, why we feel empty, why something inside us seems to be drying up. Because intimacy was never meant to be a transaction. Its essence has always been feeling. Feeling is the umbrella that tilts toward you in the rain. It is the mechanic placing a hand on an engine and sensing the faint vibration no instrument can measure. It is the thunderous roar of an old machine, coming back to life and echoing through your chest. It is being able to cry in front of another person without needing a reason and having them simply stand beside you without asking, "What's wrong?" Feeling does not need to be justified. It does not need to be quantified. It does not need to be converted into some future return on investment. Its existence is its own meaning. In the story, Elena spent a long night standing in the rain-soaked streets of New York, and on the hood of an imperfect old Mustang, she found something she had lost years ago. The part of herself that didn't need to explain, didn't need to calculate, didn't need permission. The part that only needed to feel alive. Every one of us carries an engine like that inside. Maybe it sputters sometimes. Maybe it leaks. Maybe it would fail every inspection designed to define perfection. But it has never truly gone silent. It is waiting for someone to turn the key again. Waiting for someone to ask. It's still alive. Can you feel it? So step outside. Stand in a rainstorm that serves no purpose. Listen to a sound without trying to analyze it. Love someone who can feel you, not merely understand you. Because intimacy is not an exchange of value. It is an exchange of presence. An exchange of feeling. And feelings have never needed a reason to be real.